Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey way back in time, past the ancient empires and the forgotten kings, all the way to the very beginning. We're going to venture into the primordial darkness, a place where concepts like up and down hadn't even been invented yet. You can almost feel the weight of it, the quiet hum of nothingness stretching out in every direction. Imagine sitting in a pitch-black room, not just dark, but a complete, all-encompassing absence of light and sound. That's where we're heading, the ultimate void. You might not survive this. By the way, your brain, accustomed to finding patterns and order, is about to be confronted with the most boring chaos imaginable. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, or really, the lack of one, begins with chaos. Not the kind of chaos you'd find in a messy room or a traffic jam, but true, fundamental chaos. The Greek word for it, chaos, literally means a yawning, dark abyss. It was the original state of everything, a formless, shapeless void that existed before time and space. There was nothing, and yet, somehow, there was the potential for everything. Think of it as the ultimate blank page, waiting for the first word to be written. This concept of a void at the beginning of creation is actually pretty common across many ancient cultures. Even the ancient Egyptians had a similar idea with their primordial waters of none. But here, in the Greek myths, chaos wasn't just a void, it was the very first being. It's like the universe decided it needed a name for the first thing it did. And that thing was just existing in a very unorganized way. From this great void of chaos, the first entities began to stir. The first one to emerge was Gaia, the Earth. She wasn't just the ground you walk on, she was the entire planet. A living, breathing being. Imagine her as a sleeping giant, slowly waking up and stretching. Then came Tartarus, the deep, dark pit beneath the earth, a kind of primordial dungeon. And finally, there was Eros, the embodiment of love and procreation. Now, you might think, wait, love? At the very beginning? And you'd be right to wonder. Historians still argue whether this Eros was the same mischievous, arrow-slinging Cupid of later myths, or a more fundamental, cosmic force that brought things together. It's almost as if the universe, in its first act of creation, decided it needed both a place to stand, Gaia, and a force to keep it going, Eros. Gaia, now a full-fledged entity, decided she was a bit lonely. So, she created her own companion, a son who was also her equal. She brought forth Uranus, the sky. Imagine the earth, solid and unmoving, looking up and seeing a vast, starry expanse form above her. It was a beautiful, almost serene moment. Gaia and Uranus became the first divine couple, the original power pair. From their union, the universe as the Greeks knew it really began to take shape. They had some kids, a bunch of them, actually. First came the three one-eyed giants known as the Cyclops. Then, the three monstrous hundred-handed giants, the Hecatoncheires, and finally, the first generation of gods, the Titans. There were 12 of them, 6 brothers and 6 sisters. And they were a big deal. The most well-known are probably Cronus and Rhea, but we'll get to them in a bit. Uranus, however, was not a great dad. He was kind of a monster. In fact, he hated his monstrous children, the Cyclops and the Hecatoncheires, so much that he shoved them back into Gaia's womb. Deep down into Tartarus, the pit of despair. Imagine being a mother and having your children locked away inside you. It was uncomfortable, to say the least. Gaia, in her distress, began to plot. She went to her other children, the Titans, and asked for their help. Only one was brave enough to stand up to his tyrannical father, Cronus, the youngest of the Titans. He was the one who would take the first step toward a new order, a new age, and change the course of history forever. He was a god of time, and his first act was to bring an end to the very first age of the gods. So, we left off with Cronus, the youngest Titan, getting ready to do something pretty drastic. Gaia, his mother, had given him a special sickle made from the hardest flint, and as his father, Uranus, descended to lie with Gaia, Cronus, who was hiding, did the unthinkable. He ambushed his father and, well, let's just say he used that sickle to separate the sky from the earth. It was a violent, shocking act, one that established Cronus as the new king of the cosmos. As Uranus's blood fell, it created the Erinyes, or the Furies, goddesses of vengeance who were not to be messed with. It also created the Giants, a powerful race, and the Meliae, nymphs of the ash tree. It's wild to think that such brutal violence could be the source of so much new life. But for the ancient Greeks, the line between creation and destruction was often blurry. In many myths, order is born from chaos, and new life from old death. With Uranus out of the picture, the age of the Titans officially began. Cronus, now the head honcho, freed his siblings from Tartarus and took his sister, Rhea, as his queen. Their reign was often called the Golden Age by later poets, a time of prosperity and innocence. The land was fertile, people didn't need to work hard for food, and things were generally pretty chill. Historians still argue whether this Golden Age was a genuine belief about a perfect past or a literary device used to highlight the failings of the later gods and the human condition. Regardless, it was a time of relative peace. But this new king, Cronus, had one major problem: paranoia. A prophecy from his parents, Gaia and Uranus, foretold that one of his own children would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown his father. To prevent this, Cronus came up with a truly terrifying solution. Every time Rhea gave birth, he would swallow the baby whole. First came Hestia, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. One after the other, they all disappeared into his belly. You can imagine Rhea's absolute despair. Her husband was literally eating their children. A fun fact here is that this act of swallowing children is mirrored in myths from other cultures. Like the Norse god Odin, who swallowed his mother, Ymir, to create the world. It's a recurring theme that speaks to the cyclical nature of power and the fear of being replaced. Rhea finally decided enough was enough. When she was pregnant with her sixth child, she sought help from her parents, Gaia and Uranus, who were probably still a bit sore about the whole castration thing but agreed to help. They told her to go to Crete to give birth in secret. And that's what she did. In a hidden cave on Mount Ida, she gave birth to a son, the future king of the gods. His name? Zeus. After the birth, she wrapped a large rock in swaddling clothes and presented it to Cronus. He, none the wiser and probably not looking too closely, swallowed the rock, thinking it was his newest son. And just like that, Zeus was safe, hidden away, and secretly raised by nymphs and a goat named Amalthea. As Zeus grew up, he was getting stronger, a bit of a party god in training, I imagine, and he was ready for a little family reunion. He went to his mother, Rhea, who gave him a special potion. This potion was meant to make Cronus sick. She disguised Zeus as a cupbearer for his father, and Zeus served the drink. Cronus, probably feeling a little bloated from all the swallowed kids, drank it. It worked. He became so ill that he vomited up all 5 of his children in reverse order. Imagine the scene. Poseidon, then Hades, then Hera, Demeter, and finally Hestia, all emerging from their father's gut, full grown and ready to rumble. The Titans were probably thinking, well, that's a new one. This was the family reunion from a sitcom that just got way out of hand. And it was all about to lead to a very, very big war. With his siblings now out of Cronus's belly, it was time for the next big showdown. This wasn't going to be a quick family spat. This was going to be a war for control of the cosmos. The newly freed Olympians, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Hestia, and Demeter, set up their home on Mount Olympus. From there, they could look down upon the world and prepare for battle. The Titans, led by Cronus, gathered on Mount Othries, and so began the Titanomachy, a 10-year war between the 2 generations of gods that would literally shake the foundations of the universe. For the first few years, it was a stalemate. The Titans were massive, primordial beings, born of earth and sky, and they were powerful beyond measure. But the Olympians were clever and had a certain, youthful energy. They had their secret weapon in Zeus, who was the youngest and most powerful of his siblings. Zeus, a true millennial god, was all about disrupting the old order. However, the Olympians needed more firepower. So, Zeus did what any good leader would do. He went to the source. He and his siblings ventured down into Tartarus, the same place their father had imprisoned the Cyclops and the Hecatoncheires. They freed the monstrous giants who had been trapped there for eons. The Cyclops, grateful to be out of the cosmic dungeon, decided to repay Zeus's kindness. They crafted special weapons for the three main Olympian brothers. For Zeus, they forged the thunderbolt, a weapon so powerful it could shatter mountains. For Poseidon, they created the trident, a tool that could stir up the seas and cause earthquakes. And for Hades, they made the helm of darkness, which granted its wearer invisibility. These gifts were game changers, a divine version of an epic loot drop. With their new weapons and the Hecatoncheires, those 100-handed, 50-headed giants, on their side, the tide of the war began to turn. The Hecatoncheires would just stand at the edge of the battlefield and hurl massive boulders at the Titans. 100 at a time. Imagine a rock-throwing contest. But on an apocalyptic scale. You'd probably want to sit that one out. Meanwhile, Zeus was a one-man light show, zapping the Titans with his thunderbolts. The war raged on, but the Titans were starting to falter. Even though the Titans were strong, they were also kind of boring. They represented the old way of doing things, raw, unbridled power. The Olympians, on the other hand, represented a new order, one with more defined roles and, dare I say, a bit more style. One of the Titans, Atlas, was a particularly formidable foe. He was so strong that when the Olympians finally won, Zeus gave him a special punishment. Instead of being locked away in Tartarus with the rest of his brothers, Atlas was condemned to hold up the sky on his shoulders for eternity. It's a pretty heavy task, and you can still see him doing it in the myths. This punishment is a good example of the Olympians' approach to justice. Make the punishment fit the crime. But make sure it's a really long-lasting crime. A quirky tidbit about Atlas is that the word Atlas itself wasn't just named after him. Early books of maps were called atlases, because they often featured an illustration of Atlas holding up the world. Eventually, the Olympians were victorious. They cast the defeated Titans down into Tartarus, a dark, gloomy pit guarded by the very same Hecatoncheires who had helped them win the war. The Great War was over. The old gods were gone, and the new gods had won. But the story of the Titans isn't quite over. Historians still argue whether the war was meant to be a literal retelling of a historical event or a symbolic struggle between older, more chaotic forces and a newer, more structured and civilized pantheon. Either way, the message was clear. A new era had begun, and the world was now theirs to rule. The universe, which had started with chaos, had been through a tumultuous adolescence and was now ready for its next chapter. One ruled by a family with some serious issues. With the Titans locked away in Tartarus, it was time for the Olympians to sort things out. They decided to divide the spoils of war, which was basically the entire cosmos. They drew lots to see who would get what. Zeus got the skies, the lightning, and the title of king of the gods. Poseidon became the ruler of the seas, the rivers, and the earthquakes. And Hades, well, he got the short end of the stick. He became the god of the underworld, a job that was probably not at the top of anyone's wish list. It's a good example of how power dynamics and seemingly random chance can shape the very fabric of existence. The other gods got their domains too. Hera became queen of the gods and goddess of marriage, a somewhat ironic title given her husband's later behavior. Hestia took on the hearth and home, and Demeter became the goddess of the harvest. The rest of the new generation of gods would come later, born of Zeus's many adventures. Zeus, as the new top god, was a different kind of ruler than his father. Cronus was all about raw power and paranoia. Zeus was more about a certain kind of order. But he was also prone to fits of rage and, as we're about to see, an unstoppable libido. The age of the Olympians wasn't as simple as the Golden Age under Cronus. It was more complex, with defined roles and a clear hierarchy. But it was also full of drama, jealousy, and betrayal. The pantheon of gods on Mount Olympus was less like a serene council of elders and more like a perpetually feuding, incredibly powerful family. This structure, a divine bureaucracy if you will, is one of the things that sets Greek mythology apart from many other belief systems. You had a god for everything: the sun, the moon, war, wisdom, music, a veritable pantheon of specialists. Before we get to the chaos, let's talk about the new home. Mount Olympus wasn't just a mountain, it was a real place. A magnificent palace of crystal and marble above the clouds. A place where no mortal could ever go. The gods lived in luxury, feasting on ambrosia and drinking nectar, which, by the way, was their food and drink and the reason they were immortal. You could eat all the ambrosia you wanted, but it wouldn't make you a god. It only sustained them. A fun fact here is that the word ambrosia comes from the Greek ambrotos, which literally means, not mortal. So, it was literally the food of immortality. Life on Olympus was pretty busy. There were councils to be held, disputes to be settled, and new gods to be born. Zeus and Hera, despite their tumultuous relationship, had a few children together. There was Ares, the god of war, a bit of a brute and not very popular. There was Hephaestus, the god of the forge, born with a limp and a bit of an outcast. And there was Hebe, the goddess of youth. But Zeus, as we hinted at, was a restless king. He had a wandering eye, and it wandered everywhere. He was the most prolific of all the gods, and his affairs with goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women would lead to a huge number of demigods and new divine beings. This brings us to a crucial point about Zeus. His power wasn't just about lightning and thunder. He was also the god of oaths, hospitality, and order, a kind of divine law enforcer. And yet, he broke every rule when it came to his relationships. He was the ultimate hypocrite. Historians still argue whether Zeus's many affairs were meant to explain the origins of various cultures and peoples, with different heroes and kings claiming him as a divine ancestor, or if they were just a way to make the central god a more relatable, albeit flawed, character. Either way, his love life was about to become the subject of endless myths, and it would cause a huge amount of trouble, mostly for Hera. Alright, let's dive into the most chaotic and frankly, most entertaining part of Zeus's story, his love life. As we mentioned, Zeus had a serious problem with fidelity, which was pretty awkward since his wife, Hera, was the goddess of marriage. This wasn't just a handful of flings. Zeus's list of conquests is so long it would make a modern celebrity's dating history look like a quiet Sunday afternoon. He was constantly shape-shifting to get what he wanted. He became a swan to seduce Leda, a bull to abduct Europa, and a shower of gold to get close to Danae. He even turned into a cuckoo bird just to get a hug from Hera, who, ironically, he was cheating on anyway. This constant shifting of forms is a cool little mythological quirk. It shows Zeus's power and his utter lack of boundaries. Hera, understandably, was not a fan of this. She was a goddess of formidable power and a legendary temper. She spent most of her time on Olympus plotting revenge, not against Zeus, but against his many lovers and their illegitimate children. She turned one of Zeus's mortal lovers, Io, into a cow and had her tormented by a gadfly. She cursed the nymph Echo so that she could only repeat the last words spoken to her. She even tried to prevent the birth of Heracles, Zeus's most famous son, by sending 2 snakes to his crib. This is where a lot of the drama in Greek mythology comes from. Not from the epic battles, but from a jealous wife and a philandering husband. It's a soap opera on a divine scale. And the kids that came from these affairs? They're some of the most famous figures in Greek mythology. From his union with the goddess Metis, Zeus fathered Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, who, in a slightly weird birth story, sprang fully grown from his head. This is one of the more famous tales of parthenogenesis in Greek mythology. From his affair with Leto, he had the twins Apollo, the god of the sun and music, and Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. And then there's Heracles, born to the mortal woman Alcmene. He would become the greatest hero of all time, but his life would be plagued by the wrath of Hera. It's almost as if Zeus created a whole new generation of gods and heroes just to spite his wife. Which, honestly, wouldn't be out of character. A quirky historical fact is that the ancient Greeks, especially the male-dominated society of Athens, often used these myths to justify their own societal norms. Zeus's casual disregard for marital vows and his many conquests were sometimes seen as a reflection of the patriarchal values of the time. It's like, well, if the king of the gods can do it, why can't I? Historians still argue whether these stories were originally told to explain the world or to excuse human behavior. It's a classic chicken and egg situation. Did the myths shape the culture? Or did the culture shape the myths? Zeus's affairs weren't just about procreation, though. They were also about expanding his influence and power. By fathering children with various goddesses and mortals, He was weaving a complex web of alliances and loyalties. Each child, each new deity, was a part of the new Olympian order. The age of the Olympians was one of expansion, of new gods and heroes popping up all over the place. And with all this new life and energy, the stage was being set for even more myths, even more epic tales, and even more opportunities for things to go wrong. Now, let's turn our attention from the divine soap opera on Mount Olympus to the creation of us, mortals. The story of mankind's creation is a little bit murky, but the most well-known version involves two titans, Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus. Prometheus's name literally means forethinker, while Epimetheus means afterthinker. And as you're about to find out, their names were very, very accurate. When Zeus had finally established his rule, he tasked Prometheus and Epimetheus with creating the creatures of the world. Epimetheus, being the afterthinker, went first. He handed out all the good stuff. He gave wings to the birds, claws and fur to the lions, and swiftness to the deer. By the time he got to humanity, he realized he had given away all the cool features. Humans were left naked, defenseless, and without any special abilities. Prometheus, the forethinker, was not impressed. He knew that humans needed something to survive, something to set them apart from the animals. So, he made them in a different image, crafting them from clay and giving them a posture that allowed them to look up at the heavens. Unlike the animals who were bound to the earth. But that wasn't enough. Humans were still weak and cold. So, Prometheus decided to do something about it. He went to Olympus and, in an act of what we would call divine defiance, he stole fire from the gods. This wasn't just a regular flame, it was the sacred, heavenly fire from the forge of Hephaestus, the god of the smiths, or in some versions, the sun itself. He hid the fire in a hollow fennel stalk and brought it down to earth. A gift that would change everything for humanity. Fire gave us warmth, the ability to cook food, and the means to forge tools and weapons. It was the spark that led to civilization. Zeus, however, was not happy. He had a big problem with mortals having this power. He saw it as a threat to the gods' dominance. He believed that mortals should remain subservient and dependent. This is a crucial moment in Greek mythology. It's the first real clash between a god's authority and a god's compassion for mortals. It's a classic father knows best situation. Except the father is a guy who swallows his children and turns into a swan. This story is an excellent example of a universal theme, the struggle between divine power and mortal ambition. A little fun tidbit: in some versions of the myth, Zeus was already angry at Prometheus for a previous trick where Prometheus had tried to deceive him during a sacrifice. So this was just adding fuel to the fire. Literally, Zeus's punishment for Prometheus was severe and eternal. He had the Titan chained to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains. Every day, an eagle, the symbol of Zeus, would come and eat his liver. And because Prometheus was immortal, his liver would regenerate overnight, only to be eaten again the next day. It was a cycle of endless torment. This punishment is one of the most famous in Greek mythology, a testament to Zeus's harsh and unforgiving nature when he felt his authority was challenged. Historians still argue about the exact nature of Prometheus's crime. Was it stealing fire? Or was it the earlier trickery? It's a scholarly debate that highlights the complexity of the myths and how they were interpreted over time. Either way, Prometheus's gift, though it brought so much to humanity, came at a very high price. So, Zeus had Prometheus chained up and was still pretty mad at humanity for accepting the stolen fire. He decided that since he couldn't take the fire back, he'd punish them in a different way. He ordered the gods to create a gift for humanity. A very special and very dangerous gift. Hephaestus molded her from earth and water, giving her a beautiful, perfect form. Athena dressed her in fine clothes. The goddesses Charytes and Pytho adorned her with necklaces and flowers. And Hermes gave her a cunning mind and a deceitful heart. They named her Pandora, which literally means, all gifts. Because she was a gift from all the gods. Pandora was the first woman, a being created specifically to bring trouble to mankind. Zeus then sent her down to earth to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother. Prometheus, in a moment of foresight, something his brother lacked, had warned Epimetheus never to accept a gift from Zeus. But Epimetheus, being the afterthinker that he was completely taken by Pandora's beauty and charm. He accepted the gift, and with her came a large, sealed jar. This is where a fun linguistic tidbit comes in. The story we know as Pandora's box is a bit of a mistranslation. In the original Greek, it was a pithos, a large storage jar. The word box was introduced by the 16th century Dutch humanist Erasmus, and it just stuck. It doesn't really change the story, but it's a good reminder that even famous myths can be altered over time. Pandora was told not to open the jar. A classic reverse psychology move if I've ever heard one. Her curiosity, a trait given to her by the gods, was too much to bear. And one day, she just had to take a peek. She slowly lifted the lid, and out swarmed all the evils of the world. All the bad stuff we deal with every day: old age, disease, war, famine, spite, jealousy, and a whole host of other miseries came pouring out into the world. Imagine all the worst parts of the human experience, bottled up and then released into the world with a single click. Historians still argue whether Pandora was a malicious agent of Zeus or simply a naive pawn. Her role as the source of all evil is a theme that has been a subject of scholarly debate for centuries. Terrified, Pandora quickly slammed the lid shut. But it was too late. All the miseries had escaped. All of them, except for one. At the very bottom of the jar, a tiny, fluttering thing remained. It was Elpis, the spirit of hope. It was a cruel gift from the gods. They had unleashed all the bad stuff on humanity but had left a single, tiny, fragile thing to make it all bearable. It's like they gave us a really terrible, complicated gift, and then a little note that said, "Good luck." It's a pretty cynical view of the world, isn't it? That hope is something that's only needed because everything else is so terrible. This myth, in a way, explains the human condition. It explains why life is so full of suffering and why, despite all of it, we still have hope. The story of Pandora isn't just about a box and a curious woman. It's about the origin of suffering and the enduring power of hope. It's a reminder that even in the most boring, mundane moments of life, there's a reason we keep going. So, the next time you have a bad day, just remember, it all started with a slightly too curious goddess and a really cool-looking jar. From the chaos of the gods' affairs and the suffering of humanity, a new kind of hero was born. We've talked about Zeus's son Heracles, born to the mortal woman Alcmene, and how his life was a constant struggle against the wrath of Hera. She hated him, not just because he was a product of her husband's infidelity, but also because he was destined to be greater than any other hero. Heracles was a big baby, literally. He was so strong that even as an infant, he strangled the 2 snakes Hera sent to his crib. This was just a taste of the raw, physical power he possessed. Hera, however, wasn't done. She had a long-term plan to make his life a living nightmare. When Heracles was a young man, she drove him mad, and in his temporary insanity, he killed his wife and children. When he came to his senses and realized what he had done, he was filled with immense grief and guilt. To atone for his terrible crime, he went to the oracle at Delphi, who told him he had to serve his cousin, King Eurystheus of Tiryns, for 12 years and perform whatever tasks the king assigned him. And so began the 12 labors of Heracles, the most famous set of heroic deeds in Greek mythology. These labors were meant to be impossible, each one more difficult than the last. He had to kill the Nemean lion, a beast with impenetrable hide, which he eventually strangled and then wore its skin as a cloak. He had to slay the Lernaean hydra, a multi-headed serpent that grew 2 new heads for every one he cut off. A task he accomplished with the help of his nephew Aeolus, who cauterized the stumps with fire. There was the capture of the Ceryneian hind, a sacred deer with golden antlers, which he had to chase for an entire year. Then came the capture of the Erymanthian boar, a huge, scary pig that he had to run down in the snow. And then he had to clean the Augean stables, which had not been cleaned in 30 years. A task he completed by rerouting 2 rivers to wash away the mess. A fun fact about this one: the sheer scale of the waste is a hilarious and disgusting little tidbit in the myth. The other labors were just as wild. He had to defeat the Stymphalian birds, who had beaks of bronze and could shoot feathers like arrows. He had to capture the Cretan bull, a magnificent animal that Poseidon had sent. He had to steal the mares of Diomedes, which were fed on human flesh. He had to get the girdle of Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons, which was a nice little side quest. Then came the three big ones. He had to fetch the cattle of the three-bodied giant Geryon. He had to steal the golden apples of the Hesperides, which required him to trick the Titan Atlas into holding up the sky for a moment. And finally, his 12th and final labor was to go to the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the three-headed guard dog of Hades. He did all of this, and by the end, he had earned his redemption and a place among the gods. Historians still argue about the origin of these 12 labors. Were they originally a single, cohesive story, or were they a collection of smaller myths and folktales that were later put together to form a larger narrative? It's likely the latter, as some of the labors don't seem to flow together seamlessly. Either way, they are a powerful symbol of strength, endurance, and the ability of a mortal to overcome seemingly impossible odds, all while being the target of a very, very angry goddess. While Heracles was busy with his superhuman chores, another hero was making a name for himself. His name was Perseus, another one of Zeus's many sons, this time with the mortal woman Danae, whom Zeus visited in the form of a shower of gold. Perseus's story begins with a terrible prophecy. An oracle told his grandfather, King Acrisius of Argos, that his own grandson would one day kill him. To prevent this, the king locked Danae and the infant Perseus in a wooden chest and cast them out to sea. This was a common trope in Greek mythology: try to defy fate, and it will always come back to bite you in a particularly ironic way. The chest eventually washed ashore on a small island, where they were found by a kind fisherman named Dictys. Perseus grew up, but his quiet life was disrupted by the island's king, a guy named Polydectes, who was Dictys' brother. Polydectes fell in love with Danae and wanted to get rid of Perseus. So he tricked the young hero into a seemingly impossible quest to bring him the head of Medusa. Medusa was one of the three Gorgons, monstrous sisters with snakes for hair. The terrifying thing about her was that one look at her face would turn a person to stone. This was a classic suicide mission, and a brilliant way for Polydectes to get rid of his rival. Perseus, however, was not one to be easily defeated. He got some help from the gods. Athena gave him a polished bronze shield, which he could use as a mirror to see Medusa's reflection without looking at her directly. Hermes gave him a special curved sword, perfect for the task. He also received winged sandals from the nymphs of the north, which allowed him to fly, and a helmet of invisibility from Hades. He was basically a one-man superhero squad, all kitted out with the coolest gear. A fun little detail here is that the idea of a hero being helped by the gods is a recurring theme in many mythologies. Not just Greek, it's like a cheat code for life, if you're lucky enough to have it. Perseus flew to the lair of the Gorgons. He found them all asleep. Using Athena's shield, he looked at Medusa's reflection, carefully approached her, and with Hermes' sword, he sliced off her head. From her neck, two strange creatures were born: Pegasus, the winged horse, and the giant Chrysaor. As the other Gorgons, Steno and Euryale, woke up, Perseus used the helmet of invisibility to escape. With Medusa's head in a magical bag, he flew away, but not before a couple of adventures. On his way home, he saw a beautiful maiden chained to a rock, about to be sacrificed to a sea monster. Her name was Andromeda, and she was a princess. Perseus, being the dashing hero that he was, fell in love instantly. He used Medusa's head to turn the sea monster to stone, saved Andromeda, and took her with him as his bride. This is one of the more romantic and straightforward rescue missions in the myths. A little bit of a break from all the gore and drama. When Perseus returned to his home island, he found that King Polydectes was still harassing his mother. Perseus showed up to a feast where the king and his court were gathered. He pulled out Medusa's head and, with a quick flash, turned the wicked king and all his courtiers to stone. His prophecy, however, had one more part to fulfill. Much later, Perseus was participating in a sports festival and accidentally threw a discus that hit and killed a spectator. That spectator? His grandfather, King Acrisius. The prophecy had come full circle. Historians still argue whether the story of Perseus was originally a solar myth, with his winged sandals and the blinding head, or a tale meant to establish a connection between the Greek mainland and the heroic figures of the East. From the skies and the underworld, we now venture to the island of Crete, a place shrouded in its own dark and twisted myth. The story begins with King Minos of Crete. He was the son of Zeus and Europa, but he had a bit of a rivalry with his brothers for the throne. To prove his divine right to rule, he prayed to Poseidon to send him a sign. Poseidon, being the god of the sea and generally a bit of a wild card, sent him a magnificent white bull from the ocean. The deal was that Minos was supposed to sacrifice the bull back to Poseidon. But the bull was so beautiful that Minos just couldn't bring himself to do it. He decided to keep it and sacrificed one of his own bulls instead, thinking Poseidon wouldn't notice. Big mistake. You don't double-cross a god. Poseidon, of course, was furious. His revenge was both cruel and utterly bizarre. He cursed Minos' wife, Queen Pasiphae, with an unnatural and overwhelming desire for the bull. To fulfill her strange new craving, Pasiphae had the royal architect, a genius named Daedalus, build her a hollow wooden cow. She got inside the cow, and the bull was, well, let's just say it all happened. The result of this unnatural union was a monstrous creature with the head of a bull and the body of a man. His name was the Minotaur. This is one of those fringe Greek myths that feels a little too strange to be real. But it's a central part of the story. King Minos was horrified by the Minotaur. He was embarrassed and didn't want the world to know about his wife's transgression. So, he had Daedalus design a massive, inescapable prison to hide the creature. This prison was the famous labyrinth, a complex maze of twists and turns from which no one could escape. The Minotaur was locked inside, and every year, as punishment for a war he had won against Athens, Minos demanded a tribute, 7 young men and 7 young maidens from Athens to be sent to Crete and fed to the Minotaur. Enter Theseus, a hero from Athens and another son of Poseidon. He decided to put a stop to this terrible tribute. He volunteered to be one of the 7 young men and sailed to Crete with a secret plan. When he arrived, the beautiful Princess Ariadne, daughter of King Minos, saw him and immediately fell in love. She was a bit of a traitor to her dad, but hey, love makes you do crazy things. She went to Daedalus and asked for help. Daedalus, who knew the secrets of the labyrinth, gave her a ball of thread and told her to give it to Theseus. He also gave Theseus a sword. The plan was simple. Tie one end of the thread to the entrance. Go in, find the Minotaur, kill it, and follow the thread back out. Theseus followed the plan perfectly. He ventured into the dark and winding maze, found the Minotaur in the center, and in a brutal fight, he killed the beast. He then used Ariadne's thread to find his way out and escape with her and the other Athenian youths. It was a flawless victory. A perfect example of brains and brawn working together. However, a little fun fact, when they were sailing home, Theseus abandoned Ariadne on an island. There are a few different versions of why, but one of them is that he just forgot. Which, not a great look for a hero. Historians still argue about whether the Minotaur myth was just a tale to explain the origins of an ancient building or a symbolic story about the struggle between a civilized society and its more savage, primal urges. With the Minotaur slain and the Cretan saga behind us, we move on to one of the most famous and influential stories in all of Greek mythology, the Trojan War. This wasn't just a simple conflict, it was a 10-year siege that involved a massive cast of heroes, gods, and mortals, and like most epic stories, it all started with a party, a beauty contest, and a very bad decision. The trouble began at the wedding of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis. Everyone was invited, well, almost everyone. Eris, the goddess of discord, wasn't on the guest list. She was pretty miffed about this, so she tossed a golden apple into the crowd, with the words, "For the fairest," inscribed on it. Immediately, 3 powerful goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, started arguing over who deserved the apple. They couldn't agree, so they went to Zeus to settle the matter. Zeus, being the smart, if not always moral, guy that he was, decided to pass the buck. He sent them to a mortal man, Paris, the prince of Troy, to be the judge. Each goddess tried to bribe him. Hera offered him power and a great kingdom. Athena offered him wisdom and victory in battle. And Aphrodite, the goddess of love, offered him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, who, at the time, was already married to King Menelaus of Sparta. Paris, a young man who was more interested in romance than power, chose Aphrodite. He awarded her the apple, and in doing so, He set a series of events in motion that would lead to the destruction of his city. Aphrodite, true to her word, helped Paris win the love of Helen, and he took her back to Troy. This act, the abduction of Helen, was considered a profound violation of hospitality and a personal insult to Menelaus. The Greek kingdoms, led by Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother, rallied to his side. A massive fleet was assembled, filled with legendary heroes like Achilles, the greatest warrior of his time, and Odysseus, the king of Ithaca and a man known for his cunning. A fun little tidbit: the historical city of Troy actually existed in what is now modern-day Turkey, and the Trojan War is believed by some historians to be a dramatized version of a real-life conflict. A historical event that was later turned into myth. The war lasted for 10 long years. The Greeks laid siege to the city, but the Trojans, led by their great prince Hector, were well defended within their massive walls. The war was brutal and filled with famous battles, epic duels, and divine intervention. The gods took sides, with Hera and Athena supporting the Greeks, and Aphrodite and Apollo favoring the Trojans. Achilles, the most powerful warrior, had a major falling out with Agamemnon and sat out a good part of the war. A move that cost the Greeks dearly. The death of Hector at the hands of Achilles was a major turning point, a powerful symbol of the tragic nature of the war. With the war at a standstill, the cunning Odysseus came up with a brilliant, and ultimately successful, plan. The Greeks pretended to sail away, leaving behind a massive wooden horse as a supposed offering to Athena. Inside the horse, however, was a group of elite Greek soldiers. The Trojans, believing the war was over and that the horse was a gift, brought it inside their city walls. That night, the Greeks slipped out, opened the gates for their waiting army, and sacked the city. The city of Troy was burned to the ground. Its people were enslaved, and its civilization was brought to an end. It was a tragic victory. And for the heroes who had survived, the journey home was just beginning. Historians still argue whether the Trojan horse was a literal object or a metaphor for a new kind of siege weapon or even a sudden surprise attack. The Trojan War was over. But for the Greek heroes, the real journey was just beginning. Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, was about to embark on a voyage that would make all others look like a trip to the grocery store. His journey home, chronicled in Homer's epic poem The Odyssey, was a 10-year ordeal filled with monsters, mythical beings, and the wrath of a very angry god. It was a sequel no one asked for but everyone secretly wanted. Odysseus's troubles started almost immediately. Poseidon, the god of the sea, was furious with him because Odysseus had blinded his Cyclops son, Polyphemus. So, the god of the seas and earthquakes did everything he could to keep Odysseus from getting home. The first major stop was the island of the Lotus Eaters, where the native people ate a fruit that made them forget all about their homes and their goals. Odysseus had to drag his men back to the ship, a powerful symbol of the dangers of complacency. Next, they encountered the Cyclops, one-eyed giants. Odysseus and his men were trapped in a cave by one named Polyphemus. Odysseus, with his famous cunning, got the Cyclops drunk, told him his name was Nobody, and then, with the help of his men, blinded the monster. When the other Cyclops came to help, Polyphemus just shouted, "Nobody is hurting me," a brilliant, if childish, ruse. The journey continued, and the problems piled up. They visited the island of the sorceress Circe, who turned some of his men into pigs. Odysseus, with the help of Hermes, managed to outsmart her and convinced her to turn his men back into humans. He stayed with her for a year before finally leaving. He then had to sail past the island of the Sirens, beautiful creatures who lured sailors to their deaths with their enchanting songs. Odysseus had his men plug their ears with beeswax and had himself tied to the mast so he could hear the songs without being able to follow them. It was a classic display of self-control. His trials continued with the treacherous strait of Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla was a six-headed monster who snatched men from their ships, and Charybdis was a whirlpool that could swallow an entire vessel. Odysseus had to choose the lesser of two evils and sailed closer to Scylla, losing a few men but saving his ship. Historians still argue whether the Odyssey was based on a real-life sea route or was a fictional account with metaphorical landscapes. A fun fact here is that the word Odyssey has become a modern term for a long, eventful journey. thanks to this very story. Finally, after all the adventures, Odysseus was the last of his crew alive. He washed ashore on the island of the nymph Calypso, who held him captive for 7 years. Desperately in love with him, he was eventually freed by the intervention of the gods, and with the help of the Phaeacians, he finally made it back to Ithaca. Disguised as a beggar, he found his palace overrun by suitors trying to marry his wife, Penelope, and take his throne. In a final act of heroic cunning, he revealed himself, and with the help of his son, Telemachus, he slaughtered all the suitors and reclaimed his kingdom and his wife. He had finally made it home, but it had taken him 10 years to get there. From the grand adventures of Odysseus and the epic sweep of the Trojan War, we're now going to dial it back and look at a more personal tragedy. One that shows just how inescapable fate could be in the Greek world. This is the story of Oedipus, a name that has become synonymous with tragic destiny. His story begins, as many Greek myths do, with a chilling prophecy. The king and queen of Thebes, Laius and Jocasta, were told by an oracle that their future son was destined to kill his father and marry his mother. Talk about a bad fortune teller reading. To prevent this, Laius did the unthinkable. He ordered a shepherd to abandon the infant on a mountain, with his ankles pinned together, a grotesque detail that gave him his name, Oedipus, which means swollen foot. The shepherd, however, was a kind man. He couldn't bring himself to leave the baby to die. So, he gave the infant to a fellow shepherd from Corinth, who in turn gave him to the childless king and queen of Corinth, Polybus and Merope. They raised Oedipus as their own, never telling him that he was adopted. He grew up as a prince, unaware of his true lineage. One day, at a banquet, a drunkard taunted him, saying he wasn't his father's son. Disturbed, Oedipus went to the oracle at Delphi to ask about his parentage. The oracle didn't answer his question directly but instead repeated the terrible prophecy, that he was fated to kill his father and marry his mother. Horrified, and believing his Corinthian parents were his real ones, Oedipus decided to leave Corinth forever to ensure the prophecy could never come true. It was a classic case of trying to run from your problems. But in this case, the problems were literally his destiny. On his journey, Oedipus came to a crossroads and got into a dispute with an older man and his attendants. The argument, a classic case of ancient road rage, escalated, and Oedipus ended up killing all of them. Unbeknownst to him, the man he had just killed was none other than his biological father, King Laius. The first part of the prophecy had just come true, and Oedipus didn't even know it. He continued his journey and came to the city of Thebes, which was being terrorized by a monster called the Sphinx. She had the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the head of a woman, and she would kill anyone who couldn't answer her riddle. What is the creature that walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 in the evening? Oedipus, using his wits, solved the riddle. The answer was man. A baby crawls on 4 limbs, a man walks on 2 legs, and an old man walks with a cane. The Sphinx, defeated, threw herself from a cliff and died. As a reward for saving the city, the grateful people of Thebes made Oedipus their king and offered him the hand of their recently widowed queen. And who was that queen? None other than his mother, Jocasta. The second half of the prophecy was now fulfilled. They had children together and lived for many years in ignorance. But a terrible plague fell upon Thebes. The oracle said the plague would only end when the killer of the former king was found. Oedipus, a bit of a detective, vowed to find the culprit. He began to investigate, questioning everyone, including the blind prophet Tiresias, who tried to warn him of the truth. But Oedipus was too stubborn. Eventually, the pieces fell into place, and both he and Jocasta realized the terrible, horrifying truth. Jocasta, in her grief, hanged herself. Oedipus, in his agony, gouged out his own eyes with her brooches, unable to bear seeing the world he had created. Historians still argue whether the story of Oedipus was an original myth or a morality play used to teach the dangers of hubris and the futility of trying to escape your destiny. Regardless of its origin, it remains one of the most powerful and tragic stories in all of literature. A testament to the idea that some fates, no matter how hard you try, cannot be avoided. After all that drama, let's take a journey to a place where things are a little more permanent. We're going on a tour of the underworld, the realm of the dead. ruled by Hades, the oldest son of Cronus and Rhea. You might think of it as a terrifying, fire and brimstone kind of place. But in the Greek myths, it's more of a gloomy, gray, and frankly, kind of boring place. It's not so much a place of punishment for everyone, but more of a destination for all souls. Regardless of their deeds in life, you could have been a hero or a total jerk, and you were probably going to end up in the same place. The entrance to the underworld was a pretty bleak spot. It was guarded by the three-headed dog, Cerberus, a massive beast that ensured no living person could get in and no dead person could get out. Once inside, you would find yourself on the banks of the river Styx, one of the 5 rivers of the underworld. Here, you would meet Charon, the ferryman, an old, grumpy-looking guy who would transport the souls of the dead across the river. But there was a catch. He only ferried those who had a coin. An obol, placed under their tongue before burial. If you didn't have a coin, you were doomed to wander the banks of the Styx for 100 years. Which sounds like a very boring and very long punishment. A quirky little fact, the ancient Greeks actually practiced this ritual. Placing a coin in the mouth of the deceased, a literal fee for the afterlife. Once you crossed the river, you would arrive at the palace of Hades and his queen, Persephone. Persephone, by the way, was abducted by Hades and only stays in the underworld for a portion of the year. Which is why we have seasons. Her absence causes her mother, Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, to mourn, and all the crops die. It's a fun little myth-based explanation for why it gets cold in the winter. The underworld was divided into a few different regions. The vast majority of souls ended up in the Asphodel Meadows, a gray, featureless place where they just kind of existed. They weren't happy, they weren't sad, they were just kind of there, like ghosts at a really bad party. This concept of a bland afterlife is a stark contrast to the reward and punishment-based afterlives of other religions and is a subject of great interest to scholars. For the really bad people, there was Tartarus, a dark, deep pit, where the most terrible villains and enemies of the gods were sent for eternal punishment. We've already mentioned the Titans being locked up here, but there were also other famous figures like Sisyphus, who was condemned to eternally roll a boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down every time it reached the top. And then there was Tantalus, who was condemned to stand in a pool of water under a fruit tree. Whenever he tried to drink, the water would recede, and whenever he tried to eat, the branches would move away. These punishments were creative and perfectly fit the crimes of the people who committed them. And finally, for the truly good, there was the Elysian Fields, a beautiful, sunny paradise where the heroes and the righteous would spend their afterlife in blissful happiness. It was basically the VIP section of the underworld. It's a classic example of a heaven and a hell within a single belief system. Though it was a very small and exclusive heaven, historians still argue about the exact geography of the underworld and how much of it was a literal belief versus a metaphorical one. Was it a real place or just a psychological landscape meant to scare people into being good? Either way, it was a very grim destination. And so, we've come to the end of our journey. We've gone from the primordial nothingness of chaos, through the age of the Titans, the reign of the Olympians, and the rise of heroes and monsters. The stories we've explored tonight aren't just ancient fairy tales, they're the foundation of Western literature, art, and even language. The Greeks were the first to really tell these kinds of long-form, interconnected stories, a cultural tradition that has echoed through the centuries. But eventually, the Greek gods, with all their drama and their power, began to fade. It wasn't a sudden, violent end. There was no great battle to end the Olympian age. It was a slow, quiet decline. As the Roman Empire rose and adopted much of Greek culture, they simply renamed the gods and gave them new stories. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, and so on. But over time, the old myths began to lose their power. The Romans were more interested in law, engineering, and conquest than in the whims of a chaotic divine family. Then, a new religion began to take hold in the Roman Empire, Christianity. Unlike the capricious Greek gods, the Christian God was a single, all-powerful, all-knowing being. There was no need for a god of the sea, a god of the sun, or a god of the underworld. The old Greek myths, once a central part of people's daily lives, became just that, myths. The temples were abandoned, The sacrifices stopped, and the oracles went silent. A fun fact here is that the last oracle to give a prophecy was the Oracle of Delphi, who reportedly said, "Tell the king that the adorned house has fallen to the ground." Phoebus Apollo no longer has his home. He no longer has his prophesying laurel, nor his spring, because the speaking waters have dried up. It was a poetic end to a powerful era. Historians still argue about the exact reasons for the decline of the pagan religions. Was it the rise of Christianity, the social changes within the Roman Empire, or simply the slow march of time? It's likely a combination of all three. The stories didn't die out completely, though. They were preserved by scholars and monks who, in a kind of twist of fate, kept the stories alive, even as they were being replaced by new ones. The tales of Prometheus, Heracles, and Odysseus were passed down through generations. They were retold in plays, painted on vases, and written down in scrolls. They became a part of the cultural memory of the world. Even today, we use words like chaos, Titan, and Odyssey without even realizing their mythological origins. We still talk about Pandora's box and an Achilles' heel. The myths, in a way, didn't disappear, they just changed their form. They moved from being a religion to being a powerful literary tradition. And in that transition, they became timeless. The sun is setting on our journey now. We've covered the entire scope of a civilization's belief system, from a moment of formless void to its slow fade into history. You can feel the weight of all that time, all those stories, all that drama, but it's time to let it all go. The heroes have found their rest. The gods have found their silence. The world we've explored is a very different place now. It's quieter, and it's time for you to find a quiet place, too. So, let's ease out of this history lesson. The grand sagas are over. The epic journey is at an end. Let the images fade away. The sounds of the ancient world grow dim. The feuding gods and the struggling heroes are all behind you now. There's no more need to worry about prophecies or angry gods or monsters in the dark. Just the sound of your own breathing. It's calm now. It's still. You can let the story go. All of it. The history, the myths, the battles, they can all drift away now. Like clouds on a breeze. Let your thoughts soften, your body relax, your mind quiet down. There's nothing left to do but close your eyes and let the calm wash over you. Like a gentle wave on a still shore. The stories are done, and you can rest now. Sweet dreams.